The planning tent smelled like burned coffee and diesel, and I remember thinking Captain Vance made a reasonable call. That is the part I have lived with longest. She'd arrived at FOB Calder 3 days before the assault on a standard transfer packet. No classified supplement, no annotated record, just an administrative classification that read Map Archive/Terrain Documentation, Secondary. Vance saw it. He read the top sheet and set it down without turning it over. The second page would have told him her record was filed under her maiden name after a clerical correction 3 years prior, and that the woman sitting at the far end of the planning table had run more combined counter-battery fire missions than any non-commissioned officer in the theater's recent history. He set the paper down and called the brief to order. He was a thorough officer in most things. The transfer packet was not one of them. She was 61 years old. She sat with both hands flat on the table and said nothing, while Vance laid out the battery positions and the firing solutions for the assault on Calder Pass. The pass ran north through a valley defiled the terrain analysts had long since dismissed as unfireable, too narrow, too much lateral scatter risk, unpredictable crosswind behavior off the ridge faces. The plan called for lifting fires before the lead element entered the defile, and relying on the assault force to push through on its own. Standard doctrine, conservative, the kind of plan a fire support officer writes when he has not walked the ground and does not believe anyone has walked it better. When Vance finished, she raised one hand. He looked at her. Ma'am. The left ridge deflects the crosswind at a predictable angle between 14 and 1600 hours. There's a 40-minute window for a parallel sheaf adjustment that would let you cover the lower saddle without scatter risk. The defile isn't unfireable. It's unfireable without the right table. Vance looked at her the way men look at something that doesn't fit where it's sitting, the look of a man being kind at the cost of being accurate. We appreciate the input. He said it with the specific courtesy that is not courtesy at all. Ma'am, your packet lists archive and documentation. The fire support cell needs qualified gunners at this table, not a map archivist. 19 people in that tent. I was one of them. I was the assistant S3, a planner, and I had no reason to doubt the captain's read of a transfer packet. I said nothing. Nobody said anything. She gathered her notebook, one standard green army notebook, half filled, its cover soft from handling, and she walked back to the map archive room without looking at Vance again. I went back to my work. I had a phase line to update and a logistics timeline to reconcile. I was busy. I told myself that for 3 days. The first mortar round hit at 0247. It came in without warning on the battery position's south side, and the second and third came in fast and adjusted, which meant someone had a spotter on the high ground and had walked the solution in close before firing for effect. The primary fire direction officer, Lieutenant Carver, was killed in the first 30 seconds, a fragment through the roof of the FDC shelter. The targeting computer terminal took a direct hit in the first minute. The battery went from a fully functioning direct support element to 4 guns with no firing solution, and no one qualified to build one from scratch in the dark. I was in the TOC when the battery net went to static and stayed there. The assault element was already moving toward the defile. Without suppression on the enemy counter-battery position on the eastern ridge, they would walk into a prepared kill zone at the mouth of the pass. The battalion commander, Colonel Harwick, was on the command net, saying things in the flat voice commanders use when the situation has moved past what the plan accounted for. He had 2 options: abort the assault or push through a defile with an active threat on the high ground, and he had perhaps 4 minutes to choose. She walked out of the map archive room at 0254. She had her green notebook and a handheld radio tuned to the battery net. She was wearing the same uniform she'd arrived in 3 days prior. No kit added, nothing adjusted, as if she'd been waiting with everything she needed already on her person. She sat down at the secondary fire direction table, the analog backup, a folding table, with one uneven leg that nobody used because nobody had needed to use it in the 2 years it had been sitting against the TOC's north wall. She opened the notebook to a page that was dense with hand-penciled figures. Firing tables, 4 columns per gun, deflection and elevation worked in pencil, wind correction factors calculated separately for each of the 4 ridge face orientations. She had been building this in the map archive room for 3 days. I watched her do this from 8 feet away. I did not understand immediately what I was watching. She keyed the battery net. Gun line. This is Flint seam. I'm taking fire direction. Acknowledge. Static. Then Gun 3's crew chief came up. Say again, Flint seam? Gun line. Flint seam. I have a firing table. Give me gun readiness. There was a pause that had a specific quality. 4 gun crews on a battery position at 0254 in the dark. Their FDO dead. Their computers gone. Being asked to trust a voice they had never heard on this net before. The gun line chief came up. All 4 guns ready, Flint seam. We're listening. She gave Gun 1 its first deflection and elevation from memory. No computer, no laser rangefinder output, no digital targeting solution. She read the figures in a flat cadence that did not change whether the first mission went right or wrong, and she gave Gun 2 its separate deflection 2 seconds later, and Gun 3 and Gun 4 in sequence. And then she said, "Fire for effect," as if it were the plainest instruction in the world, the way a person says something they have said 10,000 times before. The first mission landed inside the enemy counter-battery position's eastern margin. I know this because the battery observer radioed a rounds-on-target call 17 seconds later with a correction of 50 meters left, and she applied the correction before he finished speaking. Mission 2 went center mass. Colonel Harwick had come to stand 2 feet from my shoulder by Mission 4. He didn't say anything. He was a man who understood artillery, had commanded a battery himself 20 years earlier, and he was watching something he recognized. Something he had not expected to find in that room, at that table, from that person. She never raised her voice. The radio traffic she ran was clean and minimal. Deflection, elevation, fire for effect, correction applied, next mission. With no dead air between calls, no recalculation delays, no moment where she had to think back to the notebook. The figures were in her hands. She had built the table over 3 days in a map archive room, while the planning cell ran its brief without her, and she had built it as if she already knew she would need it before this night was done. Mission 7 was the hard one. The enemy counter-battery crew had shifted position 40 meters north along the ridge and re-established, and the battery observer called the shift while a second fire mission was still in flight. She split the adjustment, held Gun 1 and Gun 2 on the original deflection to complete the first mission, shifted Gun 3 and Gun 4 to the new position, and fired simultaneously, what artillerists call a parallel sheaf, 2 separate deflection sets running at once, and she ran both in her head without writing anything down, without asking the observer to hold. I have consulted with qualified fire direction officers since. They tell me a parallel sheaf adjustment of that kind, run manually from a hand table in the dark, with no digital assistance and no second brain at the table, is not a thing that is done under contact. It is not, generally speaking, a thing that can be done. Mission 9 was the parallel sheaf at 0314. 0 short rounds. The assault element reached the mouth of the defile at 0331, and the eastern ridge was quiet. The pass fell to the lead element at 0519. The enemy counter-battery position was later confirmed destroyed. 4 crew, 2 weapons, 2 secondary ammunition caches. 11 missions, 3 hours and 19 minutes. She closed the green notebook, set it on the folding table, and keyed the battery net one last time. Gun line, Flint seam. Good shooting. Stand down for resupply. She stood up and walked back to the map archive room. She did not look at Harwick, and she did not look at me. She walked the way a person walks when the work is finished, and the work was the whole point. Colonel Harwick stood in the TOC for a long moment after she was gone. He looked at the folding table with the one uneven leg. He looked at the notebook she'd left on it. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing adequate to say, at 0552 in the morning, with the smell of propellant still coming through the radio, and the pass just barely held. The after-action review was 14 hours later. Colonel Harwick ran it himself. The staff sat around the conference table, and he worked through the engagement in sequence, the way he always did, methodical and without theater. He'd asked the battery operations NCO to print the counter-battery log in full, 22 pages, time-stamped to the second. She sat at the far end of the table, same seat as the planning brief, same hands flat. The green notebook was beside her left hand, closed. Harwick read the log from the top. He read the gun line acknowledgement at 0254. He read Mission 1 through Mission 4 without comment. At Mission 5 he paused briefly and moved on, At Mission 7, he stopped, read the split adjustment entry twice, and said nothing. He turned the page. He reached Mission 9 at 03:14. He read the entry. He set the log face up on the table and did not pick it up again. He stood from his chair. It was not a salute. It was something older and less formal. A man standing, because the arithmetic of the moment required it, and he knew it. The room read him the way soldiers read a commander who has stopped performing and started meaning something. Every man at the table stood, without signal, without word, without anyone deciding to first. She did not stand. She looked at Harwick for a moment, and then she looked back at her notebook, still closed, and she said quietly, "The window closes after 1600 hours. If you want to use the table tomorrow, someone should walk the saddle." Then she opened the notebook to a blank page and waited for the debrief to continue. The classified supplement arrived 2 weeks later. I processed it myself. Her record, under her maiden name, from the Crail Valley engagement 4 years prior. 14 fire missions, 3 hours and 47 minutes, under direct threat to the firing position, 0 short rounds, the counter battery position destroyed, the element extracted clean. The branch record for a sustained manual fire direction sequence under contact, classified at her own request, to protect the surviving gun crew's identities from a follow-on inquiry that was eventually dropped. She had also authored the theater's counter battery suppression doctrine. The doctrine Vance had used to build his original plan, the plan that had written the Defile off as unfireable, was built on her framework. The same framework she'd refined at Crail Valley, the same framework she'd quietly updated in a map archive room at FOB Calder, while the fire support cell held its brief without her. I filed the supplement. I routed it where it belonged. I think about Vance's read of that transfer packet a great deal. I do not think he was a careless officer. I think he was the same kind of officer I was. The kind that reads what is in front of him and does not look for the second page, because the second page is not where the trouble usually lives. The trouble usually lives in the first page. For her, it happened to live somewhere else. What I know is this. At 02:54, when the battery net went silent, she walked out of the map archive room without being asked and without waiting. She sat at a folding table with a bad leg, and she opened a notebook she had filled on her own time, for 3 days, and she ran 11 fire missions through a defile that the terrain file still calls unfireable. I have not corrected that entry. I considered it, but the word belongs to the men who wrote it before 0254, and what she did with it after is not something the terrain file has a category for. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about the distance between a filing system and the truth. She submitted a revised firing table for the eastern approaches 2 days after the AAR. It accounted for a seasonal wind shift the terrain analysts had not recorded. The next battery rotation used it without knowing who built it. That is the table they are still using,